chapter 7, starting in verse 11 of the Gospel of Luke. And it came to pass the day after that he, meaning Jesus, went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Now, when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier. And they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak. And he delivered him to his mother. Please be seated. I read a very, Crystal asked me when I started this morning, my daughter Crystal said, is your sermon going to make me cry? And I said, well, that's pretty much what motivated me the whole time I was working on this message, was the thought of making you upset, dear. And so might as well get right to it. I read this very touching, very poignant story about a young man who was at the store. He'd gone there to pick up milk and eggs. And there was an older lady with a basket of groceries in line ahead of him at the checkouts. And she kept turning around and staring at him with sad, moist eyes. And it was starting to make him kind of visibly uncomfortable. And finally she said, Sir, I'm sorry. You just look so much like my boy, my son. 30 years ago, we had a terrible argument. That day he stormed out of my life forever without even saying goodbye, and I didn't even say goodbye to him, and I've just never got over that. And looking at you, you look so much like him. It's just very, very painful. And a single tear trickled down her cheek. Well, obviously the young man is going to be moved by this. And he asked if there was not something he could do for her. And she thought about it for a moment, and finally she said, You know, I'm embarrassed to ask you this, but would it be possible if, as I leave the store, you could just, in a friendly voice, smile at me and say, Goodbye, Mom. Because I feel like maybe that would help me feel like I had some closure with my own son. And the young man, of course, agreed, and just as she had asked, as she finished and pushed her cart toward the exit, he smiled and he waved and he called out cheerfully, Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Mom. And her face just lit up with peace. Goodbye, son, she said, and left. And again, a very poignant moment. And the young man was there, lost in thought, and the cashier is ringing up his purchases, and she looks at him and says, That'll be $112.87. And he says, For milk and eggs? And she said, Well, your mother said you were going to pay for hers too. You're such a good son. That ill-conceived bit of levity aside, I have chosen this Mother's Day to speak on a topic for a very serious reason. I will tell you from my heart, I am encountering a frightening number of mothers who, with tears in their eyes, are asking this church to pray for their wayward or unsaved children. And this morning, on this day of all days, I want hurting moms to know that Jesus sees the weeping parent. Jesus sees the weeping parent. Verse 11a, we find Jesus heading into a city, Nain, and it says there, And it came to pass the day after. And it came to pass the day after. The day after what? Well, in context, the day after Jesus had performed a spectacular miracle at Capernaum. At Capernaum, Jesus had healed a centurion's dying servant, and he had even done it long distance. He wasn't even present with the dying servant. Jesus' following grew as a result. Now, I want you to think about this in context. This centurion was a big shot of the highest order. He was powerful. He commanded 100 obedient Roman soldiers, an occupying force in Capernaum. In verses 4 and 5, however, we see something very unusual. Not only did he command the respect of Roman soldiers, he was adored somehow by the Jewish elders as well. They told Jesus, when they contacted him about the healing of the centurion's servant, they said the centurion was worthy of Christ's miracle, for he loveth our nation, and hath built us a synagogue, a place for their worship. The centurion was beloved and respected by all. And in verses 6b, 7a, this celebrity, and that's the only word I can think to describe the centurion, this celebrity publicly humbled himself before Jesus, saying, I am not worthy that thou shouldest enter my roof. Wherefore neither thought I myself worthy to come unto thee. He'd sent the Jewish elders. Now by the time Jesus gets to Nain, he no longer has this small cult following he had before. He's got an entourage, a fan club, and the paparazzi in tow. He could have easily, at this point, chosen to become healer and prophet to the rich and famous, and then focused all his love and compassion and miracles on those with staggering affluence, influence, and celebrity, like the centurion. But what does he do? He doesn't do that. Hallelujah. Verses 12, verse 13a. Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, when the Lord saw her, the Lord saw her. Now I want you to think about that. Jesus had just performed this spectacular miracle for one of the most powerful and influential figures in the region, this centurion. Jesus had gone from having people following him to having many disciples and many people following him to Nain. And yet, the Lord saw her. The Lord saw this humble widow in her grief. And I want you to understand something. In this culture, the culture of this time, this was basically a dead woman walking. She was a woman in an era when women were disregarded. That's strike one. She was a widow. That's strike two. She had just lost her only son. Strike three. And she's out. She's defenseless, and she is utterly, utterly without prospects. In her time and in her culture, with no viable means of support or protection, she would be begging for food, or worse, in just a matter of a few weeks. That crowd, that mourners, would go home, and at that point, socially and economically, she was as far from the centurion as she could possibly be. And yet, the Lord saw her. He saw her.